Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hope Over Fate, Fazle Hasan Abed, and the Science of Ending Global Poverty, by Scott Macmillan. Narrated by Scott Macmillan. To Alexandra and Isabella. The song that I came to sing remains unsung to this day. Rabindranath Tagore. Introduction. This book was originally supposed to be a memoir, the story of Fazle Hasan Abed, the mild-mannered accountant who would rid the world of poverty, as told by the man himself. For the last several years of his life, I was privileged to be the speechwriter for Abed, a man whose work changed the lives of millions. We would sit together for hours at a time, in his office in Dhaka, or in hotels in Miami, Des Moines, and elsewhere, working through his speeches line by line. During these sessions, he would share stories from the previous 8 decades of his life, of long train rides to Calcutta during his childhood in British India, or of his uncles, the last generation of Muslim Indians to learn Persian, the court language of the Mughals. He spoke of his friendship with the elderly E.M. Forster, his flight from war over the Khyber Pass to Kabul, his love life in London in the 1960s, his 3 marriages, and how, in 1972, with a few £1,000s from the sale of his flat in Camden, he launched a small non-profit organization to aid refugees, originally called the Bangladesh Rehabilitation Assistance Committee. Queens, presidents, and Nobel laureates would later call BRAC the world's most effective anti-poverty organization. He led it until he died in 2019. That seemed like a story worth telling in full, and after some coaxing, he gave me permission to begin ghostwriting his autobiography. Abed was an exceptionally private man, however. He cringed at anything with a whiff of pomposity or self-promotion. "You have me pontificating," he scolded me after an early draft of his speech to accept the World Food Prize in Iowa. He much preferred to let BRAC's work speak for itself, which may explain why so few people outside his native Bangladesh knew who he was or the magnitude of what he had accomplished. I was about halfway done with his memoir when he told me to stop. The story, as I had written it, did not feel right coming from him. His standards for the written word were high. He was an accountant, but he loved poetry and put great stock in the creative capacity of the human species, that which makes us, in Hamlet's words, the paragon of animals, our ability to create, reflect, and build. And it pained him that others might love literature the same way, but could not, only because they had the bad fortune of growing up illiterate. In the last year of his life, Abed came around to the idea that his story needed to be told by someone, even if it would not ultimately be him. He asked that I use the material I had gathered to write this book myself, in my own words. I did so, knowing many of these words would fall short of the task. Abed told stories, but he was not a great storyteller in the typical sense. He did not sprinkle his speeches with anecdotes of the quote-unquote ordinary people he had met, as politicians often do. He devised systems to accurately gather the input of the people he served, but he was more comfortable at his desk, looking at spreadsheets, than visiting program participants in person. I once pointed out that he seemed more comfortable with numbers than with stories. "But the numbers tell the stories," he replied. Here is the story he would tell of his native Bangladesh. No names or faces, no cast of characters, just a chorus of statistics. At the moment of its independence in 1971, Bangladesh was the world's second poorest country after the Republic of Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, with a per capita GDP of less than $100. A nation of 66 million living on a patch of flood-prone land the size of Iowa. 1 in 4 children died before their 5th birthday, one of the highest rates of childhood death in the world. Population growth was out of control, with the average woman bearing more than 6 children, usually on the dirt floor of her home, with no medical personnel present. Many died in childbirth. As late as 1990, the country still had one of the highest maternal mortality rates, at 574 per 100,000. But in the 1990s, almost miraculously, things began to change, and quality of life improved at a historically unprecedented rate. By 2013, under 5 mortality had plummeted from 250 per 1,000 live births, the rate at the time of independence, to just 40. Maternal mortality had dropped similarly. The fertility rate had gone from 7 to just over 2 per woman, or roughly replacement level. These changes constituted, quote, some of the biggest gains in the basic conditions of people's lives ever seen anywhere, end quote, rivaling the pace of Japan's breakneck modernization after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, according to The Economist. A British medical journal, The Lancet, wrote that Bangladesh's transformation, which took place despite widespread poverty and low per capita spending on health, was, quote, one of the great mysteries of global health, end quote. What happened? Abed's work had a lot to do with it. He was an unlikely revolutionary, having studied naval architecture and accounting in Britain before taking a job as the finance director at Shell, Pakistan. With BRAC, using novel methods drawing from his business background, he began working in a remote corner of the country to uncover the felt needs of exploited landless people, especially women. He trained and mobilized them, giving them a sense of self-worth that many had never felt before. They began standing up for themselves against landlords, corrupt government officials, and imams opposed to women's rights. Often he found that what people really needed was hope. A sense that, with a modicum of outside help, their fate could be in their own hands. He scaled up the programs to reach millions, and he did so more cost-effectively than any government would have. Incentive-based training gave health information to mothers so that they could save their own children's lives. Women took small loans from BRAC to buy cows and hand looms, the first time they had owned anything of substance. Since they had nowhere to sell the milk and fabric they produced, he built up the dairy and textile industries by launching enterprises that bought the women's goods. These enterprises, owned by BRAC, turned out to be profitable, so he plowed the money back into the poverty programs. The women's children grew up without education, so Abed launched 50,000 schools, plus a commercial bank and a university. He adapted these solutions to other countries. BRAC now likely reaches more than 100 million people in about a dozen countries in Africa and Asia. Abed's own life was a tapestry of love and sorrow. At least one of these statistics, maternal mortality, had both a name and a face. His first wife, Bahar, his soulmate and partner in BRAC, died in his arms from complications of childbirth. He rarely shared the details, and never publicly. How he ran down the street to find a doctor who might help, how the clinic's oxygen canister was empty, and how, after she lost consciousness, he tried to resuscitate her himself. There was part of him, I learned, that would have preferred to be completely alone, working in isolation, never having to tell his story. He often said that satisfaction comes when one's occupation becomes one's preoccupation. But Abed was no ascetic, self-abnegating Gandhi. He left the office at a reasonable hour and enjoyed coming home to the comforts of domestic life, to the sound of family and the warm smell of spices from the kitchen. When he spoke of his loneliness between his marriages, he told me he could never bear to return to an empty house or sleep in an empty bed for long. He loved the messy world of humans, with both its problems and its pleasures. I suspect there was one more reason Abed questioned whether his own story was worth telling. In his mind, BRAC had done relatively little to help Bangladesh rise from the ranks of one of the poorest nations on earth. All it did was create the enabling conditions. It was the poor themselves who worked tirelessly, once the conditions were in place, to change the conditions of their lives and those of their children. His own story, therefore, did not deserve as much attention as the women who had long labored on the fringes of society, who would one day, in his words, quote, be their own actors in history and write their own stories of triumph over adversity, end quote. In that spirit, this book starts not with an anecdote about Abed, but with the story of Shohida and her goats. Chapter 1. The Fox That Killed My Goat. When the fox killed Shohida Begum's goat, she was so inconsolable, it was as though her own child had been murdered. Shohida lives in the panhandle of Bangladesh's far north, where the Brahmaputra pours in from India. In some respects, this is the start of Bangladesh itself. A country created by mighty rivers, making their last few hundred miles to the sea, where the land, fertile but often flooded, and its people, constituting more than 2% of humanity, subsisting on a small patch of the Earth's surface, exist in a fragile equilibrium. Here in the north, the Brahmaputra is 7 miles wide. Its murky gray waters flowing around islands called chars, made of Himalayan silt, their shapes changing from season to season. 1,000 tributaries and distributaries merge and split and merge again, like chaotic lace. Shohida owns 3 acres of land in a fishing village on one of these substreams. Even when the paths turn to muck, she walks a mile every afternoon, sure-footed in her flip-flops, to sell her cow's milk. Since you're from a different country, you don't know about my land, she tells me. Her face is broad and leathery, with a stained-tooth smile, her gray hair covered by a yellow sari, a single piece of cloth draped over her head and wrapped around her body. It is 2016, and we're sitting outside her home, a one-room mud hut with a thatched overhang to give cover during the rain. The neighbor's walls are made of rusted corrugated iron and woven reed, lined by tattered plastic tarps. Nothing stays dry for long during the summer monsoon here, although when the sun is out, the midday heat is stifling. When I first came to this village, its condition wasn't as good as what you see here, she continued. She speaks loudly, with the confidence of someone who has overcome great odds. It was in shambles. People barely had roofs over their heads or walls to keep them safe. And if it rained, you couldn't keep anything dry. Some people didn't even have clothes to cover themselves decently, so they just wore scraps. Our house would often get flooded, but we couldn't afford to repair it. Shohida was one of the first participants in a graduation program, a term now common in development jargon, for a program that aims to boost people out of a poverty trap, with a sequence of interventions that usually includes training, livestock, cash, and, this is crucial, in-person coaching. Long after Shohida went through the pilot in 2002, the graduation approach gained worldwide recognition as one of the most effective ways to fight extreme poverty. Shohida thinks she's about 50 years old. In her generation, people born into poverty rarely know their age. There were no birth certificates and no reason to keep track of the years, since so little changed. However, for anyone old enough to remember 1971, one milestone stands out: the Bangladesh Liberation War, in which the Pakistan Army ran a campaign of genocidal rape and slaughter that ended with Bangladesh's independence. I am older than Bangladesh itself, Shohida said. I don't remember much of the war, but I remember hiding a lot. Shohida's father plowed others' lands as a day laborer. On most days, he earned enough to provide one meal a day for 4 children. Since the family couldn't afford wood for the cooking fire, young Shohida spent her girlhood collecting leaves to burn, often cutting her fingers on dried fronds. And we didn't have a latrine, she added. We defecated in the open. She married at 11, which was not uncommon. Even today, child marriage remains endemic in Bangladesh. Families in poverty tend to be eager to arrange their daughters' marriages as soon as possible, since girls rarely contribute to a household's income. A traditional marriage almost always means the girl is sent to live among strangers in a distant village. Shohida's husband was decent and hard-working. She was luckier than many in that respect. He bought bamboo and dry reeds from other villagers and used them to weave conical hats called japis, which farmers wore to protect themselves from the sun's heat. My husband was very poor, but he was a good man, she said. Our days were hard, but filled with love. The sale of japis provided their only income. They remained childless. That was Shohida's life well into her 30s. On one extremely hot day in 2000, her husband came home from the market, where he had been selling japis all morning, and collapsed, gasping on the ground in front of their hut. He said he felt suffocated and was having trouble breathing. My neighbors and I rushed him to the hospital around 1:30 p.m., but by 3 o'clock, my husband was dead. It may have been heat stroke, a heart attack, or any number of underlying conditions that proper medical care, were it available and affordable, likely would have treated. Shohida had always managed their household, gathering fuel, carrying water from the village, repairing the thatch, and cooking the daily meals. But she had never worked for money. I didn't know what to do, she said. I'd wake up and worry about how I would survive. I had no husband, no food, not even a handful of rice. I went hungry for days. She became a burden on the other villagers, who asked her how long she planned to scavenge from others' scraps. At the time, urbanization was giving rise to brick factories around the Bangladeshi countryside. Giant kilns filled the air with soot. The neighbors suggested she join other women digging and hauling clay at a brickyard several miles away. I remember not having had anything to eat for 3 days when I decided to go. I walked an hour to the brickyard south of here, on an empty stomach. All day I dug mud and carried it half a mile back to the factory in a bowl balanced on my head. Payment depended on how much clay she hauled. On some days, she received 12 Bangladeshi taka, or about 24 US cents at the time. The most she ever earned in a day of work was 25 taka. We hardly got time to take a break to eat. My workday started at 10 a.m. and ended at 6 p.m. We were allowed to take a lunch break, but taking long breaks meant I'd get paid less, so there was no time to rest. Life was a static misery, and she had no notion that anything could ever be different. In 2012, a group of strangers came to the village. They said they were from BRAC, a Bangladeshi organization known mainly for making microloans to poor women, although they provided other services as well. Their intentions seemed vague and cryptic, and Shohida wanted nothing to do with them. I didn't know who they were, she said. I didn't want to take their money. How would I return a loan? I didn't believe a word they said, and I was scared of them. The BRAC people conducted, quote, a long and tedious survey, end quote, she said, and then selected 8 destitute women, including Shohida, and promptly left the same day without much explanation. They didn't tell us anything, she said. A little more than a week later, they returned and informed the 8 women that they could choose to receive goats, cows, or chickens. We refused, she said. We said, we don't have the money to pay for any of that. I didn't want to have anything to do with BRAC. We don't want your money, the lead BRAC officer told the women. You don't have to pay us anything. We will give you cows, goats, or chickens, whichever you choose. This was not microfinance, he explained, but a program designed for people too poor for microfinance. If she chose to join, Shohida would stay with the program and receive training and support for 2 years, after which she would be on her own. The program was in its pilot stage, and it had a cumbersome name in English. Challenging the Frontiers of Poverty Reduction Targeting the Ultra-Poor, or CFPRTUP. Founded by a former accountant in 1972, BRAC was, by far, the largest development organization in the country, and by some measures, the largest non-governmental nonprofit organization in the world. In 2002, it had about 60,000 employees, ran almost 34,000 schools, and worked in 61,000 villages across Bangladesh, its services reaching an estimated 70 million people, or more than half the country's population at the time. But it had yet to build trust in Shohida's community. Several neighbors said BRAC planned to send them to a foreign country. A very frightening thought, said Shohida. My life was already miserable. I didn't want any added trouble. Though it was an organization founded in Bangladesh, a Muslim country, the neighbors warned the women that BRAC would convert them to Christianity. We all thought it was a foreign agency preying on our situation, she said. Some of the 8 women approached the matabor, the village leader, who encouraged them to participate. A BRAC appa, the Bengali term for older sister, came and talked to them several times. Another BRAC Bai, or older brother, held multiple courtyard sessions. After a month of this, Shohida and the 7 other women made a group decision to join. She recalled what the BRAC appa told her. "You are still young and physically fit. You are able to offer manual labor, but you don't have a husband or any children, no one to look after you when you're older. If you take this opportunity to improve your life, you can save up enough to take care of yourself. You will be independent." Shohida chose to receive a native breed of goats, quote, "because it sells for a good price, is easy to manage and take care of, and its meat is tastier than other breeds," end quote. In August 2002, BRAC gave her 5 female goats and a 3-day training on how to feed them, care for them, and keep them healthy. The CFPRTUP program also allotted her a stipend of 70 taka, about $1.40 per day, far more than she had ever earned at the brickyard, to give her breathing room while she learned to raise the goats. 3 days after I got the goats, she said, I took them to a neighbor who had rams. In no time, all 5 goats were pregnant. I was so happy. By this point in telling the story, the sun has risen further in the sky. Shohida invites me into her mud brick hut to avoid both the heat and the small crowd of villagers who have gathered to hear the conversation. Her home is about the size of a pickup truck, the only light coming from a crude round window opening. The interior is decorated with pictures cut out from newspapers. She said she can't read the papers and doesn't know what they mean, but she likes having these images, even black and white faces of strangers, decorating her walls. She sits down on the bed to continue. Back then, I didn't even have this bed, she said. I slept on the ground in my old straw hut, out where the courtyard is. There is still no electricity. Quote, my village received electricity only 5 or 6 months ago, but I haven't gotten the connection yet. Those electric wires frighten me, end of quote. The BRAC Bai would visit at least once a week to check on our progress. The combination of a gift of goats, the stipend, and in-person coaching had a remarkable effect on Shohida. She could now imagine a better future and began working toward it. In December 2002, 4 months after she received the 5 goats, they gave birth to 13 kids. This was the first time she had felt something akin to motherhood. She named each of the goats, and they came when called. By now it was winter, she said, so I couldn't leave the baby goats outside. They would die if they got cold. I kept them inside my hut with me. The babies slept on my bed. I covered them with my blanket and kept them warm. When I got up to use the washroom, the goats would get up too. They would run outside and do their business and drink milk from their mother. When I got back to my bed, they would jump in and take their spots again. They never urinated or defecated in my bed. They were so well-mannered. About a week after the birth of the 13th goat, a BRAC Bai came to visit. It was early morning, and Shohida hadn't yet risen. The Bai couldn't find any goats in the courtyard. The neighbors looked and couldn't find them either. The Bai knocked on her door. I heard your goats delivered, so I came to see the babies, he said. But I can't find them anywhere, neither the babies nor the mothers. Your neighbors are also looking for your goats. Where are they? You know he was worried, Shohida said, suppressing a giggle. I told him to come inside. He came in with a few neighbors. They looked around. Then I pulled back my blanket and uncovered my baby goats. Everyone was ecstatic. My neighbors
Sample complete. Ready to continue?